Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to 5 and 15. I'm Mark Gale, CEO of CO, and we're here today with a really important guest, Dan Basse of AgResource Company. And he has a many decade history of providing insight in global agriculture, how that affects countries, and ultimately coming down to the effect of us here as consumers. So as this trip we're taking around the food system because of COVID-19 and how it's affected, Dan is going to give us some really exciting global insight. He and I have had a chance to talk a couple times. So Dan, why don't you give us a little introduction and we'll be on our way.
Okay, Mark, let's keep it relatively quick. This is my 41st year of being an ag economist. I have a company I founded called AgResource Company. It's 32 years old. I've got an office in Goiânia, Brazil, and one in Geneva, Switzerland, and we try to get global agriculture right and help the food chain. And our clients range from the farmer up to multinationals and several governments get it right and see where opportunities are.
Okay, great. Well, Dan, maybe that global view is a good place to start, because here at CO, we've found our marketing and sometimes crisis communications and advertising work go more and more global as some of our clients, have mergers, acquisitions, expansion globally. So that's a much bigger thing now. A lot of what we hear, though, in America about COVID is, related to challenges here, and there are many. But maybe you could start with giving us some insight on what's happening with agriculture and food globally and how that might eventually reverberate back here to the U.S.
Well, Mark, it's a difficult position that I'm in right now, because with the office, let's say in Brazil, we just closed it down a couple of weeks ago because of COVID. But the Brazilian farmer, if you will, is making record profitability. The price of corn in reals is at a record level today. And so if you think about the opportunities, Brazil agriculture is expanding dramatically. And it's all due to currency, and a little bit the same in the Black Sea, whether it be Ukraine or Russia, which is now the wheat belt of the world. These have really changed in my time frame of being in this business. And that expansion continues unless the US dollar really starts to fall here. The problem is there's not a good currency of interchange. So I think the dollar stays in here relatively well. But the Brazilians are going through a tremendously stressful time right now, politically and health-wise. They're losing one person every minute to COVID. Their system is at least performing right now, but I worry a little bit about, will the logistics continue to allow record soybean exports, or even the now safrinha winter corn crop that's coming on. Longer term, what we're really thinking about at AgResource is food security, because there are some countries that are seizing up a little bit, that have political problems. A country like Yemen, a country like North Africa, which are now getting in this COVID. They're all looking at restricting their own food supplies. We in America have too much food, so we're trying to get rid of it, thankfully. But I do worry that as incident rates of COVID reached a new high yesterday of 133,000 people globally, that indeed that system will break down a little bit. We don't know exactly how, but it's something to watch very carefully in Latin America and throughout portions of what I would call Africa very, very acutely in the next couple of months.
Okay, interesting, because I'm sure you saw those maps in the beginning, pretty much the hot spots. You could, I remember seeing this overlay of the number of flights from China to different developed areas, and that's where it was. So what you're saying is now this is expanding to the rest of the world. And so will it be food security because of disruption of distribution, or disruption of ability to grow food, produce food in some of these areas?
Mark, it'll be a little bit of either, or both, I should say. And some countries that are seeing themselves as exporters, a lot of the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of those, which principally are grain exporters, are now looking at hoarding some of their supplies. And this, of course, will then affect the Russians, which is the world's largest wheat exporter. So, the food supply chain, or the grain supply chain, is going to be uneven. On the other side of that, we're also seeing where ship lineups, where world trade of agricultural products in the last 2 or 3 weeks has also started to subside. So not only concerned about food security, but it's the overall growth of demand. And we're trying to tell some of these countries that they really need to think about having 3 months supply on hand. And I say that because the food supply chain globally was a just-in-time inventory. Now we're telling clients it maybe need to be just in case. And so
Yeah.
that's the thesis that we're now thinking about, at least in the southern hemisphere where it's, late fall going into winter, that they need to be the most careful right now.
So just in case, I've heard you say that before, meaning that we might have to shift our long-term supply globally to having more food on hand in case there's another, or some scientists would say the next pandemic, that we need to look at
Well,
stockpiling and, global distribution of food differently?
we are not through this one yet. I don't even want to think about the next one, Mark, but we're going to have to get through this one before we get some kind of vaccine. And I do think it'll take a vaccine before the world economy has confidence again. And when I say confidence, confidence to have interactions, confidence to trade freely. The Chinese have had a problem just in the last week here where they had salmon that came in from Norway that they thought was the reason they had a spike in Beijing. And so these are the kind of things that worry us. Now, we know that the virus is unlikely to travel on salmon over that amount of time, particularly if it's cooled. So we don't think that's the issue. At least the CDC in this country has said that. But the Chinese and others have different aspects about food security and food, their own, what I call phytosanitary issues. So we'll see how that all plays out. But there's going to be bumps here. And when I talk about just in case, I talk about maybe disruptions. It can be logistically or others from several countries. And this would have a rippling effect through the food chain. We as a world have been interacting for a long, long time and trying to cut days and minutes in terms of getting it to the farm and getting it to the consumer. Now that's starting to say, well, maybe we need to have a little extra around. And we really saw this with the U.S. meat industry in terms of that choke point of fabrication of hogs and cattle, which just kind of slowed down when people were not there to fabricate carcasses and get them to the consumer.
Right. And so that's how it starts to become local here. How much of that, and I've seen some stories on this just in the last day or so. So there was this, how much should we be concerned in the US about, I mean, as good global citizens, of course, we should be concerned and certainly helping people in other parts of the world who are less fortunate. How much should we be concerned? There was some real fear over the meat supply for a little while there. And I think some of us within the industry said, you might not be able to get your exact tenderloin medallions, but you can get meat. But there was some real fear. I hear it from my neighbors, for example. How much worry do we have in the US?
Well, I think at this point we've worked through a lot of it, though we're not going to get kill levels. We're back to 95% in cattle and hogs. But I mean, if you think back just 4 weeks ago, and then President Trump kind of gave us an order that got rid of, let's say, COVID lawsuits or legalities, if you will, against some of these packers. But, amongst the food chain, we're seeing more and more infections. It's causing some slowdowns. We expect that this will have some problems for the delivery of things, not only like meats, but also will be fish and maybe some produce. And so as we go forward, there's going to be some logistical challenges. Though the big ones, along with not having the COVID workers on packing plants, has just been the funneling of all this food demand to our local grocers, or what I call the retail chain.
Yes.
It was just last year, Mark, that, for the first time in history, American consumers spent more of their dollars outside of the home on food than inside the home. We're now talking somewhere around $1.7 trillion. And so when we lost that food service industry, and we're now slowly coming back in restaurants in a lot of the country, that was a tremendous hit for the agricultural industry. And so, to reshuffle everything and say, okay, we're now going to fill all of that demand at the grocery store, left a lot of shelves barren and a lot of concerns from consumers.
Yeah, I know with manufacturers, I was on a briefing with a cheese company. Their problem was they didn't have, they supplied to food service. They didn't have a way to make, a 30-pound block of cheese really wasn't appropriate for retail. And so the difficulty for them was, some simple things like packaging and being able to distribute the product. What have been the product winners and losers? There's been a lot of talk about, for instance, you couldn't get the little Red Star packets of yeast, for example, or and some other shortages, not because there was a disruption, but just because consumers all of a sudden wanted to have, they were baking at home. Or I've heard just recently that fluid milk, for instance, has seen an uptick. what are some of the winners and losers in terms of products, agricultural / food products so far in COVID? And I guess the second part would be, is that going to stick, or is that just temporary?
Well, everything is very fluid, as you can imagine. It was just at the end of April that the U.S. milk market, or the dairy industry, was the big loser. They were looking at margins that were down 47%. So, Mark, they were, milk prices were at $10.50 a hundredweight. The dairy industry didn't know what it was going to do. You saw milk being dumped everywhere. And now today, because of consumers saying, "Hey, I'm back at home. I'm not commuting. I'm eating breakfast again. I'm putting milk in my cereal. I'm not maybe going to a restaurant as much." When you go to a restaurant and when you eat at home, the two are different. You don't order a glass of milk normally in a restaurant. You order a beverage of a pop, or maybe a liquor or something like that. And so things are changing rather dramatically. And so what was the big loser in the month of May, which was the dairy industry or milk, is now the big winner as we look at forward here, as milk prices are now back to over $20 a hundredweight. That's a 100% increase in the price of what the dairy farmers are receiving in less than 30 days. As you saw, though, we did have a CPI report that came out from the government, which kind of told us what the consumer is doing. Average food prices were up 4%. I guess you could say the consumer is a little bit of a loser, but the farmer is seeing his net income come down. And so, I was just looking at the net cash income to the farmer. It's down 10%. It's now estimated about $108.5 billion. And so, this will be the first year that the American farmer sees 45 to 50% of his net revenue coming from the government. But specifically in terms of categories, doesn't make a lot of sense, but the big winner is eggs. The price of eggs is up 20% month over month during May, followed by ground beef, and then followed by pork chops. On the bottom of that whole thing, which leads to that 4% jump, was bacon. And it makes a lot of sense because the food service industry uses a lot of bacon for flavor enhancement.
Oh, sure.
So they like to put bacon on everything. When when it's not there, bacon prices suffer, and that's been the case. And it's been one of the reasons why the hog market has been reluctant to go up. The loser here at the middle or end of June is going to be the pork industry. They're seeing their prices and profits down about 40%.
Okay. And, that's one of those unintended consequences, I guess. And, so where is the missing link? People are going to be saying, wait a minute, my cost at grocery is going up. The farmer is making less. That doesn't make sense. How, obviously there are lots of systemic reasons there, but I think that's people's first question. So, how can that be? Where's the missing link there?
Well, it's said that the choke point for agriculture has not on the farm this year. You saw farmers dumping milk. We believe that there was maybe 2 million hogs that have been euthanized either at a young age or at a slaughter state. That we backed up over 600,000 head of cattle. So the choke points have been in processing. It's this just-in-time inventory of, we get cheese stores at record levels, or butter stores are at record levels, or we can't get the meat to the consumer because the COVID fabrication is not happening. The worker there actually deboning can't get it in the right spot. We can't find workers. And so as we think back about the last 6 or 8 weeks, think about that middleman in the processing side of things. That's where the margin has gone, and that's where the volatility has been. At one point, the packer was making $1,800 per head of every animal processed in terms of a cow. And so that margin is now collapsed back down to about $640. Still very fancy, mind you, but the cost, if you will, to the consumer of rising prices hasn't flowed back to the farmer. It's been flowing back to the processor as he's trying to expand capacity and manage with what people are looking for. In a lot of cases, meat packers have been paying their workers upwards of $70,000 to keep them on the job.
Wow, a big impact. And that's one thing you don't see a lot in the news. Well, we're as we both agreed, this is going to go really fast today. So we're coming to the end here. Maybe we could bring it. So food service has it's been such a big lever in this in terms of things we've already talked about. What do you see as someone, I know you analyze, but in a way you're also making a living on, kind of predicting the future a little bit, or seeing what might be coming, providing insight. What do you see for food service, the food service recovery, and what's that going to mean to the food industry and ultimately us as consumers as well?
That's a good question, Mark, because we need that food service industry to come back. We're following reservations on Open Table. We're trying to look at the industry as a whole. It's slowly coming back. Last week, I think we had Open Table reservations, which have people that actually go to a restaurant. We were down at around 68% of normal. So it's coming back, but there's still a lot of activity that needs to include the large demand for, let's say, conventions and those kind of things. We don't see that happening anytime soon, as a lot of states will limit the amount of people that can get together, particularly in a banquet hall type of facility. So it's spacing in restaurants, it's social distancing. We'll be happy if we get back to, let's say, we're only losing 20, 25% of the food service industry. That'll be a real victory if we can make it there by September, October. Until then, we'll struggle, and we'll try to put most of this demand through the grocery. The retail's handling it quite well. But I do still see strains in the home delivery system as they're still trying to ramp up to deliver it at our stoop in front of the door.
Yeah, it's a very different equation on how those are operating. And I heard a really interesting phrase yesterday, Ariana Huffington. It's not the new normal, it's the next normal. So I think we're all trying to figure out the next normal as we go forward. Well, Dan, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I love talking to you. I feel like, wow, I just talked to Dan. I'm smarter now. So thank you for doing that. I hope others feel that way. So Dan Basse, AgResource Company, thank you so much for joining us 5 and 15. We try to give people a little insight and bring some information that maybe they didn't have their finger on. And I think you just did that by giving us a global view. So Dan, thanks. Have a great day. And we really appreciate your joining us at CEO on 5 and 15.
Thank you, Mark, and stay safe and stay well, everyone.
Stay healthy. All right. Bye now, all.